exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Seafood, T.W. Smith. Thank you very much for joining me today in episode number 97, where the main topic of today's podcast, which we're going to get to in a few minutes, is all about Chinese organized crime and martial arts, particularly their history here in the U.S., and this is going to be the first part of a series. These stories are going to be summarized very nicely by a couple of statements from a book titled The Handbook of Organized Crime in the United States by Mr. Robert Kelly, where it says, quote, "During their emerging state, Chinese gangs were, in essence, martial arts clubs headed by kung fu masters who were the Tang members. Gang members were mainly involved in martial arts, driving away American-born young Chinese from Chinatown and protecting the community from rowdy visitors." End quote. I want to quickly point out that this statement said to, quote, "protect the community," end quote. And that's not usually how we think of gangs, maybe to protect their turf. But in their emergence, gangs were often protective forces against the often brutal treatment that led to the marginalization of the Chinese community. Before I get into the main topic, and if you haven't heard me say this before, some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world listen to this program. Some of these folks are longtime supporters and contributors to this program, and I have identified those folks as what I call agents of action over at kungfupodcast.com. Now, assuming that either you're a practicing martial artist or you're very intrigued about getting into the martial arts, some of the main ingredients for being a martial artist are things like being resilient, exploring contingencies, being effective first, and efficient a very distant second. But learning to maintain an open mind to explore possibilities and contingencies and other ways to approach problems is an important component to your martial arts. And if you haven't learned that yet, then it's coming. And a wonderful example of maintaining an open mind is where you have what we might think of as a tradition, but you look at it and go, well, is that really the only way or even the best way to approach a particular problem? Well, an article written September the 22nd, 2016 by Mr. James Gaines is titled, "This School Replaced Detention with Meditation. The Results Are Stunning." In summary of the article, Robert W. Coleman Elementary School in Baltimore started offering meditation when kids began to act out. They created and utilized a mindful moment room. The author, Mr. Gaines, writes, quote, "The room looks nothing like your standard windowless detention room. Instead, it's filled with lamps, decorations, plush purple pillows. Misbehaving kids are encouraged to sit in the room and go through practices like breathing or meditation, helping them calm down and recenter. They are also asked to talk through about what happened." End quote. This plus other programs are offered as an after-school option for the pre-K through 5th grade classes. There are programs like these being set up in the UK and others here in the US, and the feedback on these programs has been very positive. They point to better attendance, better behavior scores, and better trends of markers to schools that institute these types of programs. It could be that detention and suspension are the second and third levels of corrective action for kids that act out. And perhaps the first line of correction is to help them learn how to calm down, breathe a little bit, and discuss the events and circumstances that led to their behavior. See if we can learn from them and move on. And I can get on board with that. I have spoken on many occasions, both publicly and on the podcast, about the usefulness, the abuses, and the sciences associated with the practices of meditation for both personal and martial reasons. That is the reason why I wanted to present that particular article and remind you of the free 11-day meditational challenge that I provide. The last one started October the 1st, 2016, and the next one will start January 1st, 2017. Thank you, Mr. Gaines, for publishing this very positive article about meditation and helping with the kids and their behavior. And thank you to Miss Cat, who forwarded it to me because she knew I'd be interested in it. Another thing I'm pretty excited about it is the seminar we're going to be having on self-protection against gun violence here over the weekend. It's a 2-part multi-hour program put on by Patrick. He has logged in many hours of firearms training and usage and self-protection with multiple agencies over the years. We're going to be looking at several scenarios, including what you can mentally prepare yourself for as far as expecting from a prepared shooter and the various weapons you may encounter, in an effort to be mentally and strategically prepared as much as possible if you have to face gun violence. I also wanted to announce the Martial Arts Science and Application Symposium that's going to be just outside of Charlotte. My friend Alex Ormaza, who I've met down at Myrtle Beach, who is a fantastic black belt in multiple systems, and he's very well versed in the practical martial arts, has invited me as an honorary guest down there. If you're interested in practical martial arts and would like to attend, again, that's the Martial Arts Science and Application Symposium, and you can find Alex and more information at ormazadojo.com, O-R-M-A-Z-A dojo.com. That's going to be October the 7th, 8th, and 9th, 2016 in Dallas, North Carolina. And that brings us to the main part of the program, where we're going to focus on Chinese organized crime, and it was once wrote that the New York Tong Wars, as they were collectively known, would eventually claim countless lives while generating breathless accounts in the newspapers, inspiring Hollywood movies, and reinforcing threatening stereotypes of the Chinese in America. Let me tell you a true story. On August the 12th, 1900, Lung Ken visited New York's Chinatown, as he did most Sundays. He worked uptown on Amsterdam Avenue in a Chinese laundry. For reasons unknown, he ended up at 9 Pell Street, which the New York Times described as a gloomy, grayish building of 5 stories, filled with countless holes called rooms and reeking with sickly odors. At about 6 o'clock that evening, a commotion erupted in a narrow hallway in the building. How many people were there? 6, 12, as many as 18. The news report was as confused as this chaotic scene, but this much was indisputable. After 2 gunshots rang out, the crowd quickly dispersed, leaving Lung Ken alone and fatally wounded as a pool of blood slowly formed itself around his body. Soon afterwards, police arrested Gong Wing Chung across the street on the 2nd floor of an apartment building into which he had fled. The Times wrote, Gong, when confronted with the charge of murder, never moved a muscle. As he was being led away, a smile played over his face. The shots that killed Lung would prove to be the opening salvos in a 3-decade cycle of war radiating from New York's Chinatown. Lung Ken had been a member of an organized crime syndicate called the Hip Sing Tong. Gong, his killer, belonged to its chief rival, the On Leong Tong. Within 6 weeks, an On Leong member, whose name was Ah Fi, was murdered in retaliation. He just happened to be an alibi witness for Gong and was prepared to testify that his comrade was nowhere near 9th Pell Street at the time of the killing. There had been friction between these 2 secret societies for more than a decade. They had not only battled over the financial rewards of vice such as gambling, opium, prostitution, but something else well beyond that: pride. During this podcast, we're going to start looking at how martial arts played into the cultural role of these 2 primary Chinese tongs during the latter 1800s to the mid to late 1900s. In part 1, we're just going to get from about 1850 to 1910, and we're going to begin in San Francisco and then transition ourselves to the story you just heard into New York City. So to give you a little bit of an idea of how Chinatown is as you would find it today in New York City, it is located on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It would seem to be relatively small in, say, like North Carolina terms, because it's just 2 square miles. And 2 square miles here in North Carolina could be like a bunch of woods where they do a lot of hunting and things like that. But the same 2 square mile area in Manhattan represents the occupancy of 100,000 to 150,000 people. It's also important to know that describing the cultural, political and economical force called a tong can be a little convoluted. A good description of a tong is at erienow.com, where they wrote, quote, "The family name of the Ming members, for whose return these secret societies were fighting, was Hung, and many of these organizations incorporated the Hung name into the name of their own group. Their name, however, was generally all any outsider might know about the group. Secret codes and clandestine rituals were adopted in order that the society members could operate without detection. All members were required to learn the martial arts, something that came in very useful when these secret societies aided and abetted several rebellions against the Manchus, notably during the White Lotus Society rebellion in the mid-1790s, the Cudgels Uprising between 1847 and 1850, the Taiping Uprising between 1850 and 1864, and the Boxer Rebellion which took place between 1896 and 1900. However, unfortunately for those supporters of the former Ming dynasty, when the Qing were eventually ousted from power in 1911, there were no Mings left to restore the throne. Consequently, the first president of the newly formed Republic of China was a former military general by the name of Yuan Shikai. He was, unfortunately, no more able to rule the country than the average man in the street, and China continued to flounder in an atmosphere of near total political chaos. With the political leadership in disarray, the people looked elsewhere for guidance and reassurance. They turned to the secret societies which flourished as never before. For the majority of the Chinese people, the most significant event of the early 20th century was the first wave of the Chinese immigration to America. Suddenly, a whole range of Chinatowns sprang up, all the way down from both the west and the east coast of the USA. These communities not only gave the new Chinese settlers a sense of home in their otherwise foreign surroundings, but they also had a secondary, far more sinister role to play. The different Chinatowns served to facilitate the establishment and growth of those Chinese secret societies that had wielded so much influence back in the old country. Two groups in particular were of special importance, the Tongs and the Triads. Defining precisely what the Tongs represent is a complicated affair because it involves a cursory knowledge of how Chinese society operates. Originally, the word was an anglicization of the Mandarin Tong, meaning a lodge or hall. Although this generally referred to the group operating within such a hall rather than to the building itself, much like a Masonic lodge refers to the members of the society rather than the place in which they meet, and a church can be the congregation as much as it is the building where the congregation worships. A Tong group consisted largely of unrelated Chinese people united to assist one another by a bond that includes secret ceremonies and oaths. Traditionally, therefore, whenever the Chinese found themselves transplanted en masse to a new surrounding, as they did when they immigrated to Canada or America, the Tong would be one of the first organized groups to set up operations. A prime example of this occurred in British Columbia in 1862, when on arrival in their new country, the Chinese immediately set about establishing the Chi Kung Tong to aid and abet them in both family and business matters. The Tongs were, and still are, deeply respected within Chinese society, due for the most part of their revolutionary history, in particularly those times when they fought against the Manchus and the Qing dynasty. The Chinese look back with pride on those days, revering the Tongs and bestowing on them an almost legendary status. We already know that martial arts is usually part of the Chinese culture no matter where it goes, and we've identified that it was also part of the subculture and organized crime. And along with these particular rituals, routines, and codes that would go almost unnoticed by most folks, they were all required to learn martial arts as well. In the publication called Tong Wars, the untold story of vice, money, and murder in New York's Chinatown by Scott Seligman, he accounts for many of the battles and skirmishes that existed inside this community. Seligman's book reconstructs the key moments in New York's Tong's bloodiest battles. But before we do anything else along that, we need to step back just a little bit further and consider the question, how and when did New York City become a major Chinatown? In the 2012 book, Organized Crime by Howard Abeniski, he reported that Tongs arrived in the U.S. in 1848, mostly on the West Coast near San Francisco. They came for work, and the vast majority of them were men. Many of them had the dream to come work in the gold mines and then return back to China, marry, and have a family. But most of these Chinese men got saddled with the worst possible jobs, particularly those dangerous aspects of gold mining, such as blasting shafts and laying tracks down in these deep mines. In Kung Fu Podcast number 87, The Lies I've Told About Martial Artists, we looked at how gangs, martial arts, and temples are all a place that marginalized people begin to look for social capital. We also discussed marginalized communities and martial arts in Kung Fu Podcast number 89 and 90, where we were reconstructing the history of karate. And we looked particularly at the Okinawan history, who have been marginalized since as far back as you can go. Well, after the arrival of the Tongs in 1848 into the U.S., which also brought Chinese martial arts with it as well, the marginalization problem was exacerbated, which makes the pursuit of social capital even greater. Like, for example, creating martial arts associations would become very appealing. But then a significant piece of prohibition legislation was enacted by San Francisco. And other anti-Chinese efforts were advanced by people like Samuel Gompers, who lived from 1850 to 1924, as he established the American Federation of Labor. In 1882, the U.S. government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned the entry of Chinese laborers into the U.S. This prejudicial act was not removed until 1943, when the U.S. needed China as an ally in the war against Japan. Capturing many stories that will help you understand the Tong and the martial arts and what was going on in San Francisco's Chinatown is a book titled Hatchet Men, The Story of the Tong Wars in San Francisco's Chinatown, and I've got the Kindle edition to it. It was written by Richard Dillon, who the Amazon description says, quote, one of California's premier historians, tells the compelling story of San Francisco's exotic pre-1906 Chinatown when vicious hoodlum gangs held sway. Chinatown, as demonstrated by Dillon's fast-paced narrative, became a cauldron of chaos teeming with thugs, prostitutes, gamblers, and warlords preying on scores of helpless victims. As the Tong Wars ripped through San Francisco's Chinatown, the Chinese inhabitants lived under a reign of terror. Opium was abundant, as were the slave girls, who were women imported for the purpose of prostitution. Hatchet-wielding killers silenced any opposition. End quote. Dr. Ben Junkins, who I will refer to many, many times on this program, and you can find his work by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ben, B-E-N, Ben. And he wrote an essay titled Tools of the Trade, The Use of Firearms and Traditional Weapons Among the Tongs of San Francisco, 1877 through 1878. And he published this article March 25th, 2013. Ben starts the essay by basically dispersing of a myth, where he has a heading titled The Evolving Relationship Between Firearms and the Martial Arts. And he writes, we often hear things like traditional martial arts was the most amazing technology of violence until the invention of the firearm. And once the firearm took over, traditional martial arts was no longer necessary and was lost except for a few great masters that kept these secrets. And when you read the research, what you're going to find is that is rubbish. As many researchers will tell you, the traditional martial arts as you know them today had their golden age during the Ming Dynasty and was developed after the prominent use of firearms. Ben writes, quote, in actuality, firearms have been a dominant battlefield technology since the Ming Dynasty, about when the modern synthesis of skills that we now think of as martial arts were first coming together. Likewise, these two technologies coexisted for much of the Qing dynasty, and further, they seem to be complementary goods rather than substitutes. Far from one replacing the other, both seem to gain popularity under similar sets of circumstances." End quote. The 1870s was a fascinating period to explore for other reasons as well. Many of the great names of the southern Chinese martial arts, such as Hung Fei Hung, the Hung Gar system, Chan Hung, the Choli Foot system, and Liang Zhang, the Wing Chun system. All of these folks were actively shaping their systems during this period. If you ever wondered what sort of weapons an early practitioner of Wing Chun or Hung Gar may have realistically expected to encounter on the street, listen to this. Ben does some research about San Francisco's Chinatown and what the police discovers in this community during the late 1800s. And he writes, quote, "While the Chinese population of the city in the late 1870s may have been less than 9% of its population, they seem to have been inordinately overrepresented in the police department's evidence lockup. Nearly half, 47% of all the weapons confiscated from suspects and held as evidence in 1877 through 1878 came from Tang members or other Chinese criminals. This figure no doubt reflects the dominant role that the Tangs had already come to play in human trafficking, illegal gambling, and narcotics. The larger number of firearms and fighting knives being confiscated from within this community was also probably an artifact of the early stages of the Tang War, which was set to escalate dramatically in the early 1880s. Certainly crime was a pervasive problem in Chinatown, and most of the victims of this violence were other Chinese immigrants. So the San Francisco police had confiscated and put in the evidence lockup, for example, 3 types of knives. There was the fixed blade and single-edged knives, and those represented 30% of the confiscated weapons in police possession. The last category of knives, labeled as fighting knives, is a composite category that Ben creates to indicate a more tactical weapon that the police usually came across and took a note of. These included specialized blades and fighting knives that fell outside of the norm established by the multi-purpose Bowie knife. Examples of fighting knives include long or short double-edged daggers, butterfly swords, which were also carried by the Chinese Tang enforcers, and anyone fighting with a pair of blades. These more specialized weapons were less common, but as a category, they still made up 27% of all the weapons held by the San Francisco police in 1878. So imagine, if you will, you're a martial arts practitioner and you're getting ready to walk into one of the Triad or Tang headquarters in San Francisco. What could you expect? At EerieNow.com, they actually had some pictures of the Tang headquarters in San Francisco. So let me try to describe this to you. Imagine, if you will, that you walk into the Tang headquarters of San Francisco, and there's an older man sitting there in the room, nearly 7 years old, sitting on to the left of this altar. He's lighting incense, and he's placing it on this beautifully decorated altar that has teas and fruits and cakes and all kinds of small ornaments on it. And behind that small table is a much larger and broader one that's got vases and flowers and large gold-looking deities, jade dragons, and fantastic cultural items that you may see at any Chinese place of business or martial arts school. And here's an excerpt from the Triad Society initiation ceremony, where the incense master says, "As a vanguard, are you versed in civil and military matters?" And the vanguard says, "I am well versed in both." The incense master says, "Name the 18 kinds of military arts you learned at Shaolin." And the vanguard says the following: "First, I learned to use the rattan shield. Second, the use of metal darts. Third, the use of the trident. Fourth, the use of the metal rod. Fifth, the use of the spear. Sixth, the use of the wooden staff. Seventh, the use of the sword. Eighth, the use of the halberd. Ninth, the use of the fighting chain. 10th, the use of the iron mace. 11th, the use of the walking stick. 12th, the use of the caltrops. 13th, the use of the golden barrier. 14th, the use of the double sword. 15th, the use of the duck-billed spear. 16, the use of the Sui Yung sword. 17, the use of the bow and arrow. And 18, the use of the lance. So that was a description of an actual picture if you're walking into a Triad or a Tong's headquarters in San Francisco. And Ben writes, as known figures on the margins of this economic underworld, this is exactly the sort of environment that individuals like the leaders of the Hung Gar, Wing Chun, and Chole Foot systems would have found themselves in. It is clear that at least some Southern arts, such as Wing Chun, are a direct response to this level of social disruption and potential violence. In other cases, gangsters and triad members simply opened their own martial arts schools to train enforcers and to act as a cover for their more nefarious activities. Firearms were clearly part of this world, but so were knives, daggers, short swords, and other weapons. It would be important for a student of the traditional Chinese martial arts that was trying to learn full self-protection skills on how to best handle themselves when dealing with various types of weapons and various types of violence. Well, it could almost go without saying that if you were living in a neighborhood and your neighborhood turned south, you might be looking for somewhere else to move. This rapid and harsh marginalization that occurred from 1848 through 1880 drove these immigrants from the west, from San Francisco, to the east to places like Houston, Chicago, and eventually to New York City. In an article titled Immigration Remade New York in the Late 19th Century, it writes that New York's population nearly quadrupled between 1870 and 1900. This is the exact same time period that the opening story, the murder of Lung Kin, who was part of the Onlyon Tong, took place. This New York City population explosion shot up almost to 3.5 million people, making it the world's second largest city after London. New York City became the adoptive home of J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, and it boasted immense wealth, and it also became known as a global cultural capital with the establishment of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Carnegie Hall. At the same time, though, New York was a city of profound poverty. In 1890, Jacob Riis, the Danish-American photographer, writer, and activist, wrote that, quote, 3/4 of its people live in tenements, and the 19th century drift of the population to the cities is sending ever-increasing multitudes to crowd them. The system that was the evil offspring of public neglect and private greed has come to stay, a storm center forever of our civilization. Nothing is left but to make the best of a bad bargain. End quote. Well, making the best of a bad bargain describes well the situation of New York's Chinese immigrants. In the terms of the development of a Chinese community in the 1870s, New York was a frontier town. By 1880, the growing enclave in the Five Point slums on the southeast side of New York was home to nearly 1,100 Chinese people in 1880. In the 1870s, there was a group of Chinese who were illegally smuggled into New Jersey, and eventually they made their way to New York, and it sparked an explosion of Chinese hand laundries. So let's take a couple of moments and review where we are. In 1848, the Tongs arrived in the United States, particularly on the West Coast, and they came here with a dream. They became marginalized. In 1882, U.S. law forbid any others to come in, and something I didn't mention at that time that greatly increased this marginalization is that there were very few Chinese women here already, and then basically none were allowed to come in, and this also increased marginalization. People were being driven west in order to get out of the riots and the fear and the violence. New York was growing exponentially anyway. And these Chinese people, this Chinese diaspora, was bringing their martial arts and everything else in their culture with them. Well, shortly after this, a man named Tom Lee was dispatched from San Francisco by an entity called the Six Companies. The Six Companies represented practically all the Chinese in California. They tried to work with local governments in an attempt to reduce the movements against the Asians. But the Six Companies were formed to help the Chinese come from and return to China, to take care of the sick and the hungry, and to return corpses to China for burial. They had also tried to protect their people from the abuses that the San Francisco Chinese had suffered at the hands of racism and violence. Tom Lee was supposed to both support and impose order on the growing Chinese in the New York City populace. So here goes Tom Lee. He's leaving San Francisco. He's dispatched, and he's moving east to go up to New York City. And the author Seligman, who we mentioned earlier, says this about this movement of Tom Lee from the west over to the east. And he says, quote, "Nobody likes disorder. And the Chinese in America, they had so much going against them, so many problems. They," referring to the Onlyang Tong, realized that if Chinese were massing in other cities, they needed a similar structure. The Chinese looked at that as being real positive. They were used to hierarchy, and they were used to authority. Why not replicate a power structure familiar from the motherland? If your village has always had a head man to whom you could go for adjudication, you would want the same in Chinatown." End quote. So Tom Lee has left San Francisco, and he's taken his skills and his knowledge to New York City, and let's see where that takes us. Tom Lee's arrival to New York City came as the Chinese confronted rising discrimination. Most of the Chinese people spoke poor, if any, English, and the police certainly didn't speak Chinese. Now, this New York Police Department that I just referred to is referenced in the time frames of the 1870s. It's important to remember that most Chinese had no control of the English language. And this New York Police Department that we just mentioned didn't speak Chinese, and in fact, they had only been recently put together. The New York Police Department was formed in 1845, which means they were only 25 years old at the time. And to this very day, the ethnic law enforcement barrier continues to be addressed, as described in the article titled "Chinese American Police Officers Rise at New York Police Department," and it was written July 7th, 2014, where we're going to find Captain Tommy Ng. He's in charge of the 109th Precinct, and he says, "When officers from the same ethnicity are in charge, Chinese people feel more welcomed and their voices can be heard." And he goes on to say that the New York Police Department is trying to put more Chinese officers into Chinese communities because if there's a problem communicating, they'll have to find an interpreter and waste critical moments for solving a crime. Well, we can imagine that if this is still a problem that has to be addressed in 2014, how difficult do you think it was being there with the racial, the religious, and the cultural barriers that existed in 1870? With that being said, though, there was a silver lining in this marginalization. Because if you were a good, law-abiding Chinese person and you couldn't really get protection due to the language barriers, there was also the advantage that neither could the bad guys. The criminal element, the people who were running the gambling halls, the prostitution and drug rings, they couldn't get help either. These bad guys craved protection from the authorities and they couldn't get it. So this language and cultural barrier was a massive problem on both sides of the law. But our Tom Lee, who was shrewd and opportunistic and spoke a decent amount of English and even had an American wife, began to gather the bosses up. He announced that he would be taxing them, and the money would be used to pay off the police and the alderman. Now, an alderman is a municipal contact. He's usually right behind the mayor as far as rank. Then Tom Lee cleverly built strong ties with the bosses of Tammany Hall by giving lots of money. And Tammany Hall was an Irish Catholic-dominated fraternal society that mushroomed into the dominant political force in New York politics. Tammany Hall rewarded Tom Lee by making him a deputy sheriff in 1880. And this, as you could imagine, was extraordinarily significant. As Seligman writes, quote, Li was the first Chinese to hold any government office, appointive or elective, in New York's history, and he wore his new title quite literally as a badge of honor affixed to his suspenders." End quote. So the Chinese criminal element now had their first law enforcement inside man in the New York area by 1880. And recall for a moment what we talked about within the San Francisco Police Department, where these tongs were identified on one side of the law and all the havoc and violence that they created through the weaponry found. Well, think about this development. Tom Lee would later become the leader of the Onlyong Tong crime syndicate in New York City. He not only had the political ties, he also became a member of the law enforcement. And these gangs and martial arts connections would become so well known that they were depicted in cinematic features such as Kurt Russell's 1986 classic, Big Trouble in Little China, where at moviepilot.com they write, quote, "The film references known members of New York City's Chinatown mob. The name of the murdered gang leader, Lim Lee, who is the character reference to Tom Lee, the leader of the Onlyong Tong crime syndicate in New York City's Chinatown in the early 20th century that fronted itself as a merchant association." Also in the movie, the character that plays Thunder was a practical Chinese martial artist who actually instructed the Hong Kong police. End quote. The dispatch of Tommy Lee from San Francisco to New York City in 1870 will become a critical component of the Chinese cultural movement and history here in the U.S. As this diaspora moved to New York, it already had the Chinese martial arts in it. And during the next podcast, we're going to pick up the details of who these gangs were and their relationships with the Tongs, who was training these up-and-coming martial artists, and why, who would become their number one enemy. And perhaps even more importantly for some of you who might have a direct interest in little pieces of it, we're going to look at how this evolves into pulling in particular styles and who was associated with those. So, for example, in an article titled "Photos of Bruce Lee and the Early Martial Arts Culture of San Francisco Bay," written at Fightland blog by Charles Russo, says, "In the post-World War II era, the San Francisco Bay Area became one of the great melting pots of martial arts culture in the West. In San Francisco's Chinatown, this culture anchored around Lao Bon, the Choli-Foot Kung Fu master and local Tong enforcer who opened up one of the very first Chinese martial arts schools in America. And around 1959, a hot-headed 18-year-old Bruce Lee is going to have a run-in with this Choli-Foot group." Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 97, where we began looking at the Tongs, the Triads, and these secret societies, and how they began basically as protectors of a community and then began, let's say, evolving into not-so-nice groups. But more importantly, as how did martial arts, just as a subculture, move through this process? Because it was always there. And as you're going to see in the next podcast, there's going to be some names and some people that you might even be aware of and how they were associated, at least as far as history sees them, in this secret society. Don't forget about the meditational challenge, and whether you practice meditation or not, I always would encourage you to take a few moments for yourself. Practice your martial arts for whatever reasons, whether it's for your good health, whether it's for learning how to protect yourself, whether it's for sport, for show. Just get out there and practice. Do your best. Learn to hone your craft, and no matter where you are today, try to set a little place out there in front of you that you could be a little bit better or maybe a little bit more patient in the process. Take care of yourself. This is Sifu T.W. Smith, and I'll be talking with you again real soon.